Elinor Voss made a decision on the carriage ride to London. This was the last time. She would attend the parties, she would wear the dresses her aunt had already paid for, she would smile at the right moments, and then she would go home. Back to the small estate in Wiltshire that smelled like rain and old books. Back to the garden that no one else cared about. Back to the life that was quietly, stubbornly hers. She was 31 years old. And according to every drawing room in Mayfair, that was already too late to matter. She had heard it so many times that the words had stopped stinging. Such a pity about Elinor. Pretty enough when she was younger. But she has that look about her, too much opinion, not enough sense. She had never disagreed with the last part. Her Aunt Margaret Voss sat across from her in the carriage, adjusting her gloves with the focused intensity of a general preparing for battle. "You will not stand in corners this year," Margaret said, "not a request." "I don't stand in corners," Elinor replied. "I stand near windows, there's a difference." "There is no difference to the people watching." Elinor looked outside. The countryside was giving way to cobblestones, to noise, to the gray crowded sky of the city she had never quite learned to love. "Aunt Margaret," she said quietly, "I am 31, the battle is over." Margaret was silent for a moment. Then, with a firmness that was also somehow tender, she said, "The battle is never over until you decide it is." Elinor didn't answer. She had already decided. She just hadn't told her aunt yet. The house they stayed in belonged to a distant cousin who spent most of the year in Edinburgh. It was narrow, slightly cold, and smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. Elinor liked it more than any ballroom she had ever entered. She unpacked her own things. The maid offered to help. Elinor thanked her and sent her away. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the 3 dresses hanging on the wardrobe door. Her aunt had chosen them. They were beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they are designed to be looked at rather than worn. Elinor had also brought a 4th dress. Dark green, slightly unfashionable, bought 3 years ago from a seamstress in the village who had measured her with warm hands and honest eyes. She would wear that one first. The first invitation arrived before dinner. Lady Ashworth's spring ball, Saturday evening, the event of the early season according to her aunt, who read the card 3 times with an expression of profound relief. Lady Ashworth's, Margaret repeated, as though the name itself was a form of medicine. "Elinor, if you conduct yourself well, I will conduct myself exactly as I always do." "That," said her aunt, "is precisely what concerns me." Elinor lay awake that night longer than she intended. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the city outside, carriages, voices, the distant sound of someone laughing too loudly on the street below. She thought about Wiltshire. The way the morning came slowly there, without announcement. The way silence was not something to be filled but something to be kept. She thought about the look on people's faces when they asked, "Are you married yet?" and she said no. And they rearranged their expressions into something that was supposed to look like sympathy, but always landed closer to satisfaction. She thought about the fact that she had not cried about any of it in a very long time. She didn't know if that meant she was strong, or if it meant something had simply gone quiet inside her. Something she used to listen for in her younger years that had eventually stopped making noise. She turned onto her side. One season, she told herself, smile at the right moments, then go home. She closed her eyes. Outside, London carried on without her, bright and loud and entirely indifferent. Lady Ashworth's ballroom was exactly as Elinor remembered it. Too warm, too bright, too full of people who were looking at each other without actually seeing anyone. She stood near the window, not in a corner. She would insist on that distinction until her last breath, and held a glass of champagne she had no intention of finishing. The music was lovely. The conversation around her was not. Across the room, her aunt was already working. Margaret Voss moved through a ballroom the way a chess player moves pieces, deliberate, patient, always 3 steps ahead. Elinor watched her stop beside Lady Pembroke, exchange kisses on both cheeks, and begin the quiet negotiation that passed for small talk in this world. Elinor turned back to the window. Outside, the street was dark and ordinary and honest. She preferred it considerably. She was doing well, she thought. She had smiled 4 times. She had complimented 2 women on their dresses without being asked. She had successfully avoided Lord Harcastle, who had once cornered her near a potted plant for 40 minutes to explain his opinions on the proper management of tenant farmers. It was, by her personal standards, a triumphant evening. And then she heard her name. It came from the other side of a large arrangement of white flowers, tall enough to block the view, not tall enough to block sound. 3 women, their voices low and bright with the particular pleasure that comes from a conversation one is not supposed to be having. Alina recognized one of them, Mrs. Fiona Crail. Sharp eyes, sharper tongue, married well and never forgiven the world for how easy it had been. Poor Margaret, Mrs. Crail was saying, dragging that girl out again this season. It's almost difficult to watch. That girl. Alina, who was 31 years old, pressed her fingers a little more firmly around her champagne glass. She was handsome once, another voice offered, generous in the way that a knife can be generous, sliding in smoothly. She's still handsome, Mrs. Crail said. That's almost worse. A plain woman accepts her situation. A handsome woman who refuses every reasonable offer and then wonders why she's alone, a small pause, loaded with implication. There's a stubbornness to it, something not quite right. She's too old now regardless, the third voice said, matter of fact, as though reporting the weather. No one of any standing will look at her seriously. She had her chances. She did, Mrs. Crail agreed. And she wasted every one of them. Now she's just another pause, background, you know the type, present at every event, relevant at none. A soft ripple of laughter, quiet, comfortable. The laughter of women who had decided long ago exactly where everyone stood. Alina did not move. She was aware of her own breathing. Slow, careful, the way she had learned to breathe in rooms like this so that nothing showed on her face, nothing reached her eyes, nothing gave them the satisfaction of knowing the words had landed. She was very good at this. She had been practicing for years. She set her champagne glass down on the windowsill. She would leave. Quietly, as always. She would find her aunt, say she had a headache, and be back at the narrow house within the hour. She had turned to go when she heard the other voice. It was not loud exactly, but it was the kind of voice that carried low, unhurried, with the particular authority of someone who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. Forgive me. The 3 women fell silent instantly, the way people fall silent when the temperature in a room changes without warning. I couldn't help overhearing. Alina stopped walking. She turned very slightly, not enough to be obvious, just enough to see. He had come from nowhere, it seemed, or from the direction of the entrance, where a small group of late arrivals had gathered. Tall, dark coat. The kind of face that had seen something, though you couldn't immediately say what. She did not know him. He was looking directly at Mrs. Crail. You were discussing Miss Voss, he said, still that same tone, calm, almost conversational. I believe I heard you suggest she was too old to matter. Mrs. Crail recovered quickly. She was practiced at this. Your Grace, I assure you we were simply too old, he repeated, as though testing the weight of the words, as though finding them extremely wanting. She is what, 30, 31, silence. I ask, he continued, because I am 33, and I was under the impression that I still mattered considerably. He looked at each of them in turn, without heat, without cruelty, and somehow that was worse. I'd hate to discover I was mistaken. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Mrs. Crail's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Enjoy the rest of your evening, he said pleasantly, and turned away. Alina had not moved. She was standing 6 feet from where this had happened, half behind a pillar, and she was quite certain that the ground beneath her had shifted in some minor but irreversible way. He hadn't done it for her. He couldn't have. He didn't know her, hadn't looked at her, hadn't known she was listening. He had done it because he meant it. That was the part she couldn't quite account for. He walked directly past her on his way toward the far end of the room, and then he stopped. He turned, looked at her. Something moved across his face, brief, unreadable. Miss Voss, I presume, he said. Alina lifted her chin. You have me at a disadvantage, sir. James Ashford, he said. Duke of Ralston. A pause. I apologize if I overstepped. She studied him for a moment, this man who had walked into a ballroom and said, loudly and in front of everyone, exactly what he thought. "You didn't overstep," she said carefully, "but I didn't need rescuing." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, almost. "No," he said, "I don't imagine you did." He inclined his head a small, precise bow and continued on his way. Alina stood very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her champagne glass from the windowsill and took a slow sip. It tasted, she thought, considerably better than it had 5 minutes ago. She didn't mean to speak to him again that evening. That had been the plan, a very sensible plan. Alina thought to file the encounter away somewhere quiet in her memory, to feel whatever complicated thing she was feeling about it in private, and to move on with the remainder of the evening as though nothing particularly significant had occurred. She was almost successful. She found him 20 minutes later, entirely by accident, near the refreshment table. She had gone for water, just water. She was not looking for him. She was not thinking about him. She was thinking about water and the headache she was planning to develop within the next quarter hour. He was standing with 2 other gentlemen, listening to something one of them was saying with the patient expression of a man who had somewhere better to be. He saw her at exactly the wrong moment. Their eyes met across a small silver tray of untouched sandwiches. Alina made an immediate internal decision to be mature about this. She would nod politely, she would take her water, she would leave. Instead she heard herself say, "Your Grace, a moment if you please." The 2 gentlemen looked at her with mild interest. The Duke said something quiet to them and they drifted away with the trained discretion of people long accustomed to being excused. He turned to face her fully. "Miss Voss." Alina straightened. She had prepared nothing. This had been a considerable oversight. "I wanted to," she began. "That is what you said earlier to those women." She paused. "I wish to express my gratitude," he offered. "I was going to say acknowledgement." He looked at her. "Acknowledgement of the fact that what you did was," she stopped again. The word kind felt too soft. The word correct felt too cold. "Unnecessary," she finished. A beat of silence. "Unnecessary," he repeated slowly. "I don't mean that as an insult," Alina said, which was precisely what a person said when they had just delivered an insult. "I mean that I was managing the situation perfectly well on my own. You were walking away. I was choosing to walk away. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression had changed, not offended, not amused, exactly. Something more attentive than either. "You're right," he said. "There is a difference." Alina blinked. She had prepared, somewhere in the back of her mind, for an argument. The absence of one was slightly disorienting. "I'm not ungrateful," she said more quietly. "I want to be clear about that. I simply—" She stopped, started again. "I have been managing conversations like that one for a very long time. I have a system." "A system, yes. And what does the system involve?" "Leaving," she said, quietly, without giving anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. He considered this seriously, which she had not expected. "That's a good system," he said at last. "Effective, low cost." "Exactly." "The problem," he said, "is that it only works on the person leaving. Everyone else carries on exactly as before." Alina opened her mouth, closed it. She hated that he was right. "That," she said with great dignity, "is not the point." "What is the point?" "The point is that I don't need a duke to defend my relevance in a ballroom." "No," he agreed. "You clearly don't." He reached past her unhurried and poured himself a glass of water from the table. "But Mrs. Crail does need to occasionally be reminded that her opinions are not facts. That has nothing to do with you." Alina stared at him. "So you did it for Mrs. Crail," she said flatly. "I did it," he said, "because what she said was wrong and I happened to be standing there." He looked at her over the rim of his glass. "You were simply the subject." How very reassuring. The corner of his mouth moved. There it was again, that almost smile she had noticed earlier. As though he was keeping it on a short leash and finding the effort mildly entertaining. "You're not what I expected," he said. Alina raised an eyebrow. "You had expectations. Everyone in a room like this comes with expectations attached." He glanced briefly around the ballroom at the careful arrangements of people, the deliberate performances of enjoyment. "You seemed different from across the room. Up close you are considerably more, he paused, selecting the word with evident care. Difficult, Alina offered. I was going to say specific. She looked at him for a long moment. In her experience, men who said things like that were either being genuine or performing genuineness, and the performance was usually detectable within 3 sentences. She had been listening carefully for 4 minutes now. She hadn't detected it yet. That was either very good or very dangerous. She wasn't sure which. I should return to my aunt, she said. Of course. She took a step, then stopped because she was Alina Voss and she could not leave a thing unfinished. For what it's worth, she said without turning around. The acknowledgement stands, whatever you intended by it. A pause. Noted, he said. Miss Voss. She walked away. She did not look back. She was almost completely certain that he was smiling. That night, lying awake in the narrow house that smelled of someone else's perfume, Alina stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who had defended her without needing her gratitude, argued with her without raising his voice, and called her specific as though it were a compliment. She thought about this for considerably longer than she had intended. One season, she reminded herself, smile at the right moments, then go home. She closed her eyes. It took much longer than usual to fall asleep. There was a story people told about Alina Voss. It was not the true story, but it was the one that had survived, which in Alina's experience was how most stories worked. Not the truest version wins, but the most convenient one. The convenient version went like this. Alina Voss had been a perfectly acceptable young woman of 18 who had, for reasons no one could quite explain, developed ideas above her station. She had turned down a good offer. She had been difficult. And now, at 31, she was living proof of what happened when a woman trusted her own judgment over everyone else's. The end. The true version was longer, and considerably less tidy. She had been 19, not 18. People always got that wrong, as though shaving a year off made the story more dramatic. And the man had not been a good offer. His name was Charles Whitmore, second son of a baronet, adequate income, pleasant face, extremely confident handshake. Her father had approved of him within the first dinner. Her aunt had begun discussing dress fabrics before the second. Alina had tried. She had genuinely tried to find something in him worth the life they were proposing. She had listened to him talk about his horses, his club, his opinions on various topics he had never deeply considered. She had watched the way he spoke to servants. She had noticed the way he looked at her, not as someone he was curious about, but as something he had selected. She had said no on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Her father had not spoken to her for 6 weeks. The silence had been the easy part. What came after was quieter and more permanent. The shift in how people looked at her, the slight recalibration, as though she had been moved from one column to another in some invisible ledger. Marriageable to difficult, hopeful to lost cause. She had been 19 years old. She had not understood yet that a woman's refusal was never quite just a refusal, it was an announcement. It told the room something about her, and the room did not forget. More offers had come in the years that followed. 3, to be precise. She had considered each one honestly, which was more than most people knew. The first was a widower of 52 who wanted a mother for his 4 children and made no particular secret of it. Alina had wished him well and meant it. The second was a man she had genuinely liked, warm, funny, kind in small, consistent ways that mattered more than grand gestures. She had spent 3 months wondering if liking was enough. She had concluded, quietly and with some grief, that it wasn't, not for her. She needed something she couldn't name yet. She had said no and cried about it afterward, alone in the garden which no one knew. The third had been 2 years ago. A respectable gentleman, everything correct about him, nothing wrong. She had sat with the idea for a week. And then one morning she had woken up and thought about what her days would look like, measured out in his preferences, his schedule, his vision of what a wife should be, and something in her chest had simply refused. She had written a very polite letter. None of this was what people meant when they said she had wasted her chances. What they meant was simpler. She had chosen herself repeatedly over the available alternatives. And in the world Elena moved through, that was the one choice a woman was never quite forgiven for. The estate in Wiltshire had come from her father, who had died 3 years ago in a manner that was undramatic and slightly unexpected, a fever, a week of it, and then silence. They had made a kind of peace before the end, her father and she. Not a full peace. More the kind that happens when two people run out of time for anything else. He had left her the house and a small income, enough to live, not enough to be comfortable in any season requiring new dresses. Her brother, William, had inherited everything else. William was 34 and married and lived in Shropshire and wrote letters twice a year that were cordial and completely empty of anything real. Elena wrote back in the same spirit. They had always been strangers to each other, even in the same house. She had the garden. She had the library, 3 walls of books her father had collected without ever quite finishing. She had a dog named Horatio who was 11 years old and disapproved of mornings. It was a small life. She had spent a long time making her peace with it. She was almost there. What no one saw, what no one thought to look for, was what Elena carried beneath the composure. Not regret, exactly. Regret implied she would have chosen differently. She wouldn't have. But there was something. A particular kind of loneliness that was different from ordinary loneliness, the loneliness of a person who had never been truly known by anyone, who had stood in rooms full of people for over a decade, perfectly capable of conversation, perfectly able to perform the expected version of herself, and who had never once felt that the person performing was the person being seen. She had stopped expecting it. That was perhaps the most honest thing about Elena Voss. She had stopped expecting to be seen and had built a life that didn't require it. It was a reasonable life, a dignified life. She had almost convinced herself it was enough. And then a man with a calm voice and an almost smile had called her specific, as though he meant it as the highest possible compliment, and something she had thought was finished had made a small, inconvenient sound, like a door she believed was locked, turning. James Ashford had been back in England for 7 months. It felt, most days, like considerably less. The war had a way of staying with a man, not dramatically, not in the way that made for good stories at dinner tables. Nothing so clean as that. It stayed in smaller ways, the way he woke before dawn without meaning to. The way loud rooms made something in his chest go quiet and watchful. The way he sometimes sat in his study at Ralston Park and looked at the walls and could not, for the life of him, remember what he used to think about before. He didn't speak of it. There was no language for it that wouldn't make people uncomfortable, and James had spent enough of his life managing other people's discomfort. He was the 6th Duke of Ralston, which meant he had been training for a specific kind of performance since he was old enough to understand what the title meant. Presence, composure, the particular gravity that rooms expected of a man in his position. He had learned it young. He had worn it for so long that most days he couldn't feel the edges of it anymore, couldn't tell where the performance ended and the person began. The war, oddly, had been a relief from that. In the field, no one cared about his title. They cared whether he made good decisions under pressure, whether he kept his head, whether the men beside him could trust him when it mattered. He had been good at that. Coming home had been the harder thing. Her name had been Sophia. He did not think about her as often as people assumed. That was the strange part, not that it didn't hurt, but that the hurt had changed shape. It was no longer about Sophia herself, whom he had understood, in honest retrospect, only partially. It was about the version of the future he had carried with him through 2 years of war like a photograph in a coat pocket, something to take out and look at when everything else was smoke and noise. He had come home to find the photograph was of someone else's life. Sophia had married in his 2nd year away, a perfectly reasonable man by all accounts. She had written him a letter, careful, kind, gutting in its care and kindness, explaining that she had not known if he was coming back, that she had waited as long as she felt she could, that she hoped he would understand. He had understood. Understanding had not made it simple. What followed his return was a specific kind of London attention that James found nearly unbearable. He was 33. He was a duke. He was unmarried. This combination produced, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair, a kind of low, continuous hum of interest that followed him into every room he entered. Mothers recalibrated. Daughters were positioned. Invitations arrived in quantities that bordered on absurd. His own mother, a woman of formidable energy and extremely clear objectives, had begun mentioning eligible young women with the quiet persistence of water finding a crack in stone. Lady Cecily Ford is to be at the Ashworth ball, she had said 3 days before the event. Lovely girl, sensible family. You danced with her sister 2 years ago if you remember. I don't, James had said. You did. A pause. She'll be wearing blue. Mother. I'm simply informing you of the color. He had gone to the ball intending to stay 1 hour, to be seen, to satisfy the minimum requirements of the season, and to leave before anyone could position Lady Cecily Ford in his direct path. He had not planned on Mrs. Crail. He had not planned on Eleanor Voss. He had heard the conversation by accident, passing too close to that arrangement of white flowers on his way to find the host. He had stopped without deciding to. There was something in Mrs. Crail's tone, that smooth, satisfied certainty, that had touched a nerve he hadn't known was exposed. He had heard that tone before in different rooms about different subjects. The tone of a person using cruelty as social currency, spending it freely because no one had ever made it cost anything. He had made it cost something. He hadn't planned that either. What he hadn't expected was Eleanor, standing 6 feet away, half behind a pillar, perfectly composed. The conversation had been about her. She had heard every word of it, and she had been in the process of leaving, not fleeing, not crumbling, simply removing herself with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had done this many times before and had stopped expecting anything different. That was what had stopped him. Not her face, though she was striking in a way that had nothing to do with fashion. Not the green dress that was slightly the wrong season and entirely the right choice. It was the look on her face, composed, tired, unsurprised, the look of someone who had long ago decided that the world was a particular way and had made their arrangements accordingly and was simply getting on with it. He recognized it. He saw it every morning in his own mirror. She had tried to thank him and made a mess of it, which had been the most genuinely entertaining thing that had happened to him in 7 months. She had called his intervention unnecessary. She had told him she had a system. She had stood in front of him with her chin lifted and her composure firmly in place, and said exactly what she thought without appearing to notice that this was extraordinary. Because in James's experience, and it was extensive, and it was London, and it was relentless, almost no one said what they thought. Not to him, not to a duke. They said what they calculated, what they positioned, what they hoped would land well. Eleanor Voss had told him his help was unnecessary. He had walked away from that conversation thinking about it more than was reasonable. He was still thinking about it. His secretary had confirmed her name the following morning. Miss Eleanor Voss, Wiltshire, father deceased, small estate, unmarried. Then, after a pause that suggested Hargreaves had opinions, a notable figure in certain circles, not for conventional reasons, James had put the paper down. He had not asked for more. He had thought about it for the rest of the morning. The thing about Eleanor Voss he was beginning to understand was this: she wanted nothing from him, not his title, not his protection. Not the social elevation that proximity to a duke could provide. She had practically handed his intervention back to him with both hands, politely but firmly, like a gift that had arrived at the wrong address. In 7 months of London, no one had done that. He wasn't sure what to do with it. He wasn't sure he wanted to figure it out from a distance. They did not arrange to meet again. That was the thing Eleanor would think about later, how none of it was arranged. How it happened in the way that inconvenient things often happen, which is to say gradually and then all at once, without anyone making a single conscious decision to allow it. The first time was 4 days after the ball. Her aunt had dragged her to an afternoon exhibition at a gallery in St. James's, paintings, watercolors, a small crowd of people who were there partly for the art and mostly for each other. Eleanor had been genuinely looking at a landscape of the Scottish Highlands, large, grey, magnificently indifferent to human concerns, when she became aware of someone standing beside her. She turned. He looked, for a fraction of a second, as surprised as she felt. Then the composure returned to both of them simultaneously, which was almost funny. "Miss Voss, Your Grace." They looked at the painting. "Scotland," he said. "Presumably," she agreed. A pause, a perfectly comfortable pause which was itself slightly alarming. "Do you paint?" he asked. "No, do you?" "Badly. My mother considers it a personal failing." "My aunt considers it a personal failing that I don't," Eleanor said. "We could introduce them. They would have a great deal to discuss." He looked at her sideways. "That almost sounded like a joke, Miss Voss." "It was entirely a joke, Your Grace." The almost smile appeared, stayed slightly longer this time. They looked at the painting for another moment. "It's very good," Eleanor said. "The light is wrong for Scotland in summer, but I think he knew that. I think he painted the Scotland he wanted rather than the one that exists." James was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous interpretation." "Is there an ungenerous one?" "He got it wrong." "He got it differently," Eleanor said. "There's a difference." He turned to look at her fully then. Something in his expression she couldn't quite name, not amusement this time. Something more serious, moving behind his eyes like weather behind glass. "You do that often," he said. "Do what?" "Find the more forgiving version of a thing." Eleanor considered this. "Not always," she said honestly. "Sometimes things are simply wrong." "How do you tell the difference?" She thought about it seriously because the question deserved it. "Whether the mistake hurt anyone," she said at last. "A painter getting the light wrong hurts no one. That can be forgiven easily." He was quiet for a moment. "And things that do hurt someone, those," she said carefully, "take longer." He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he was still working out. Her aunt appeared at her elbow before she could say anything else. "Your Grace." Margaret Voss executed a perfect curtsy, her eyes moving between the two of them with the rapid assessment of a woman cataloging information at speed. "What a lovely surprise." "Mrs. Voss." He inclined his head with easy courtesy. "Your niece was just explaining to me why a painter's failures can be considered successes." Was she? Margaret looked at Eleanor with an expression that contained, in equal measure, delight and warning. "It was a short conversation," Eleanor said firmly. "The best ones often are," James said. He bowed to both of them correctly, precisely. "Enjoy the exhibition." He moved away into the crowd. Margaret said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then, "Eleanor, don't. I haven't said anything." "You were about to say 17 things." Margaret pressed her lips together, looked at the Scottish landscape. "It's very grey," she said mildly. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "It is." The second time was a week later, at a small dinner party hosted by a Lady Forsyth who collected interesting people the way others collected porcelain. Eleanor was seated, by some architecture of fate or meddling she couldn't quite determine, 3 places down from James on the opposite side of the table. Far enough that conversation was not expected, close enough that it was occasionally unavoidable. He was talking to the woman beside him, something political, something about land reform, his voice too low to hear clearly. But she caught words, caught the way he listened when the woman responded, actually listened without the glazed patience she was accustomed to seeing on men's faces when women spoke about things that mattered. He caught her watching once. She looked away immediately, with, she felt, reasonable dignity. When she looked back, he had returned to his conversation. At the end of the evening in the entrance hall while cloaks were being retrieved, he appeared beside her. "You disagreed with something," he said quietly. "At dinner I could see it." Eleanor glanced at him. "I disagree with many things. Specifically when Lord Forsyth spoke about the northern counties." She was quiet for a moment. "He's never been north of Derbyshire." "No, he was speaking about people he's never met as though they were a problem to be managed." "Yes." A pause. "What would you have said?" She looked at him. "Are you asking what I think?" "I am." No one asked her that, not at dinner parties, not in drawing rooms, not in the polished, carpeted, carefully arranged spaces where opinions were performed rather than exchanged. She told him what she thought. He listened without interrupting, asked one question, a good one. Listened to that answer too. Her cloak arrived, she took it. "Thank you," he said as she turned to leave. "For what?" "For answering honestly." She looked at him for a moment, this man who kept doing unexpected things in expected places. "You're very strange for a duke," she said. Something shifted in his expression, something warmer than the almost smile, something that reached further. "I'll take that," he said, "as a compliment." She left before she could smile back. She smiled in the carriage instead, alone in the dark, where no one could see it and draw conclusions. The third time she stopped counting. It was Margaret who said it first, which Alina supposed was inevitable. They were sitting in the narrow house on a Tuesday evening, rain against the windows, the remains of dinner between them. Her aunt set down her teacup with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. "He seeks you out," Margaret said. "We move in the same circles," Alina said. "It's coincidence." Alina. "I have moved in these circles for 40 years. Men like James Ashford do not coincide." Alina looked at her tea. "He's a duke," she said. "He's 33 and unmarried and back from the war, and every mother in London is pointing daughters at him. Whatever this is, these conversations, it's novelty. I'm different from what he's used to, that's all." "And if it isn't?" The question sat in the room. Alina picked up her teacup, set it down again. "Aunt Margaret," she said quietly, "I know how this works. I have watched it for 12 years. A man like that, when he decides to be serious, when he's ready, he will choose someone young and correct and entirely uncontroversial. Someone his mother approves of." A pause. "Not someone who has been called too old and too difficult and too everything for the better part of a decade. You don't know that." "I know it very well, not bitterly, just honestly. And because I know it, I intend to enjoy these conversations for what they are and feel no particular way about them afterward." Margaret looked at her for a long time. "You are already feeling particular ways about them," she said gently. Alina said nothing. Outside, the rain continued against the glass, persistent, honest, not waiting for permission. "Go to bed, Aunt Margaret," Alina said at last. Margaret rose, paused at the door. "Being careful," she said, "is not the same as being safe." She left. Alina sat alone in the quiet room for a long time. She knew her aunt was right. She also knew something else, something she had not said aloud, because saying it aloud would make it real, and real things had consequences. The door she had thought was locked. The one that had made that small sound the night of the ball was not just turning now. It was open, just slightly, just enough to let in a draft. And Alina, who had spent years learning not to want things she couldn't have, was standing in front of it with her hand on the wood and no idea what to do next. It started, as these things always did, with something small. A glance noticed by the wrong person. A conversation that lasted slightly too long. Two people standing near a window at Lady Forsyth's dinner, talking in low voices about things that were nobody else's business. That was all it took. By the following Tuesday, Alina heard it from 3 separate sources, which meant it had been in circulation for at least a week before it reached her. The version Mrs. Crail was telling, and of course it was Mrs. Crail, Alina thought, of course, was this. Miss Alina Voss, having failed to secure a husband by conventional means, had set her sights on the Duke of Ralston. She had engineered their encounters. She had positioned herself deliberately. She was, in the language of drawing rooms that preferred their cruelty, dressed in concern, making a spectacle of herself. The secondary version, slightly kinder and therefore more insidious, suggested that the Duke was simply being charitable, that he had taken pity on a woman of limited prospects and advanced years, 31, people said, in the tone usually reserved for natural disasters, and was performing a small social kindness by speaking to her occasionally. Both versions agreed on one thing. Alina was the problem. She found out on a Wednesday morning. The letter came from a woman named Dorothea Hale, a former schoolfellow, not a close friend but a decent one. the kind of person who delivered bad news because they felt you deserved to know rather than because they enjoyed telling it. I write because I think you would wish to be informed rather than surprised, Dorothea wrote, in her neat, careful hand. The talk is unkind and I believe unfair. But it is spreading and I wanted you to hear it from someone who means you well. Alina read the letter twice, set it on the table, looked out the window at the London street below, gray sky, a woman with a basket, two boys arguing over something small and urgent. She felt in sequence, a cold flash of anger, then a deeper tiredness, then something that surprised her with its force, not humiliation. She had been past humiliation for years, something closer to grief, because she had been careful. She had done everything correctly, kept the conversations brief, never sought him out, maintained the precise distance that should have kept her safe. She had been so careful, and it hadn't mattered. It never mattered. That was the part she should have remembered. A woman in her position didn't get to be seen talking to a man like James Ashford without the room writing a story about it. The story was always the same. The woman always wanted something. The woman was always the problem. She folded Dorothea's letter, put it in her pocket, went downstairs to tell her aunt she had a headache and would not be attending Lady Pemberton's luncheon. The consequences arrived within the week. Small things. The kind of things that could be explained away individually and were devastating collectively. An invitation that didn't come, to a gathering she had attended for 3 years running. A conversation that stopped when she entered a room, the particular stop, not the natural pause of people noticing an arrival, but the stop of people who had been discussing the arrival. Lady Forsyth, who had been warm, who had seated her at interesting tables and introduced her to people worth knowing, suddenly unavailable, twice in a row with perfectly reasonable excuses. Doors closing. Quietly. One by one. Alina noted each one without expression. At night in the narrow house, she sat with Dorothea's letter and a cup of tea gone cold and thought about Wiltshire, about the garden, about Horatio, who was 11 and disapproved of mornings and asked nothing of her beyond the occasional walk and the reliable presence of his dinner. She thought about the fact that she had known. She had told her aunt, "I know how this works," and she had been right, and knowing had not protected her from anything at all. James heard it on a Thursday. It came from his secretary, Hargreaves, who delivered difficult information with the same unvarying tone he used for everything else, which James had always appreciated and which on this particular morning felt like a small mercy. "There is talk, Your Grace," Hargreaves said, setting papers on the desk, "regarding Miss Voss, the nature of your acquaintance, various interpretations." James was quiet for a moment. How widely? Considerably. Another pause. "And the source?" Mrs. Crail is the most active voice, though at this point the original source is largely irrelevant. James set down his pen, looked at the wall. He thought about Alina at the gallery, finding the generous version of a painting that had gotten the light wrong. Alina at the dinner table, knowing exactly what she thought and saying it when asked. Alina in the ballroom that first night, composed, tired, unsurprised, walking away from a conversation that had been gutting her with quiet efficiency. He thought about what this would cost her. He understood these circles well enough to know precisely what a rumor like this did to a woman in her position. He needed to do something. He did not, as it turned out, think it through carefully enough. The opportunity presented itself that Saturday at Lord Whitmore's reception, a large, well-attended affair. The kind of event where public gestures were amplified simply by the number of people available to witness them. Alina was there. He saw her from across the room, standing near a window, as always, with the composed expression she wore in public like armor. She had not seen him yet. He crossed the room with a specific purpose and a plan that seemed, in that moment, entirely reasonable. He would make it clear. Publicly, plainly, in a way that left no room for Mrs. Crail's version, he would demonstrate that Alina Voss was a woman worthy of respect, that his attention was a mark in her favor, not evidence of her scheming. He would, in short, defend her, as he had done at the ball, and it had worked then. He reached her. "Miss Voss." She turned. Something moved across her face when she saw him, relief and caution arriving simultaneously. "Your Grace." I had hoped to find you here, he said, clearly, warmly, loud enough. Heads turned, of course they did. They always did when he spoke in rooms. I've been meaning to ask, he continued, whether you might do me the honor of a walk in the park tomorrow. Green Park, perhaps, 11 o'clock. The silence around them was not large, but it was complete. Alina looked at him. He saw it happen the precise moment she understood what he was doing, what he thought he was doing, how it would look, how it would land, an invitation, public, from a duke to a woman already being talked about, generous, well-intentioned, and absolutely catastrophically wrong, because it didn't say this woman is worthy of respect. It said this woman has caught the Duke of Ralston's attention. Which was exactly what Mrs. Crail had been saying all along. Alina's expression did not change. That was the worst part. She was so practiced at this that nothing showed on her face. How kind, she said, perfectly pleasant, perfectly composed. I'm afraid I have a prior engagement, a beat. Of course, James said. Something in his chest had gone very still. Another time, perhaps. Perhaps, she said. He inclined his head, moved away. He made it to the far side of the room before understanding fully, completely, what he had just done. He had stood in a crowded room and called attention to her, to them, in exactly the way that would feed every rumor currently circulating. He had done it publicly, conspicuously, with the best possible intentions. He had tried to help. He had made it worse. Alina left the reception 40 minutes later. In the carriage, alone, she pressed her fingers against her closed eyes and breathed slowly. He had meant well. She was certain of that. James Ashford was not a cruel man. She had spent enough time in his company to be sure of it. He had seen the damage being done, and he had tried to fix it the only way he knew how, with visibility, with the weight of his name, with the assumption that his attention was a gift that would solve the problem rather than deepen it. He had not understood. And that, more than Mrs. Crail, more than the closed doors, more than any of it, was the thing that settled in Alina's chest like a stone. Because a man who did not understand this, who could not see that his protection could become its own kind of trap, was a man who moved through the world with a freedom so complete he had never once had to think about what it cost the people he was trying to help. He was good. She believed that, but good was not the same as understanding. And Alina had spent 31 years in a world that was full of good men who did not understand. She had not planned to say anything. That was the truth of it. She had decided in the carriage home from Whitmore's reception that the cleanest thing was silence, to let it pass, to keep the remaining weeks of the season as quiet as possible and then go home to Wiltshire and let London become something she thought about occasionally, less and less, until it was just a thing that had happened. She was good at that. She had practice. But then he came to find her. It was 3 days later. A Wednesday afternoon, gray and close, the kind of London weather that pressed down on everything and made rooms feel smaller than they were. She was at her aunt's preferred lending library on Piccadilly, a narrow, serious place that smelled of paper and candle wax and the particular quiet of accumulated thought. Alina had come alone, which her aunt had permitted with the slightly pained expression of a woman choosing her battles. She was reaching for a book on the upper shelf when she heard the door. She knew before she turned around. She wasn't sure how. Miss Voss, she turned. He was standing just inside the door, hat in hand, looking, and this surprised her, uncertain, not the composed, unhurried man she had grown accustomed to, something less arranged. Your Grace, she kept her voice even. This is unexpected. I know. He paused. Hargreaves told me you come here on Wednesdays. I apologize for the I should have sent a note. You should have, she agreed, not unkindly but honestly. He accepted that without flinching. The library was empty save for an elderly gentleman asleep in a chair near the fireplace, a book open on his chest, contributing nothing to the situation in either direction. James crossed the room slowly, stopped a proper distance away, looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, careful, stripped of its usual ease. I made things worse, he said. At Whitmore's, I understand that now. Alina looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and placed the book she was holding back on the shelf, buying herself 3 seconds. Yes, she said, you did. I know what you were trying to do. She turned back to face him. That's not the same as it being right. He was quiet. Do you understand, she said slowly and carefully, what that looked like? In that room, to those people, in the current climate of what is already being said. I thought if I was visible about it, visible, she said the word as though examining it. You thought visibility would help, because for you, visibility is protection. Your name, your title, your presence in a room, these things protect you. She paused. They don't protect me the same way. They never have. He opened his mouth, closed it. Good, she thought. Listen. What you did, she continued, in front of that room, publicly, conspicuously, with everyone watching, confirmed every single thing Mrs. Crail has been saying, that I have been seeking your attention, that there is something between us that I have been engineering. A pause. You handed her the story she wanted, and you wrapped it in kindness. The silence in the library was very complete. The elderly gentleman by the fire turned a page in his sleep. Eleanor, James began. It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land somewhere she hadn't prepared. Don't, she said quietly. Please don't apologize yet. I need you to understand first, not just to be sorry. He stopped, nodded once. She took a breath. I am not angry at you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I believe you are a good man, and I believe you meant well, and I believe that in your world, in the world you have always moved through, what you did made perfect sense. Your name is a shield. You offered it. That was generous. But, he said, but I am not in your world. I have never been in your world. She looked at him steadily. I'm a woman of 31 with a small estate and no husband and a reputation for being difficult. The rules for me are not the rules for you. What costs you nothing can cost me everything. And I genuinely cannot afford to have a man, however good, however well-intentioned, making decisions about my situation without understanding what my situation actually is. James was very still. I should have asked you, he said, low. Before doing anything, I should have asked. Yes. I didn't think, no, she said gently. You didn't because you've never had to. She paused. That's not a criticism, it's just true. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes, not the weather she had seen there before, something more unsettled. Like a man revising a map he thought he knew. What has it cost you? He asked quietly. What I did. She had not expected him to ask that directly. She was quiet for a moment, deciding how honest to be. She decided on entirely. 3 invitations that didn't come, she said. Lady Forsyth twice. A dinner next week that I know I will not be included in. Small things. A pause. They're always small things, that's how it works. Nothing dramatic enough to point at. Just doors closing quietly. Until the room you're allowed to be in gets smaller and smaller and you start spending the season near windows because at least the view doesn't make you feel like a problem. Something crossed his face. Sharp and brief. I'm sorry, he said. And this time it landed differently, not an apology for a specific action, something larger, something that seemed to come from further down. I know, she said. The silence between them was different now. Not comfortable, not that, but honest. The kind of silence that exists after something true has been said and both people are sitting with it. I have been pretending, Eleanor said at last, that these conversations were something they weren't. I told myself it was novelty for you, diversion, that I was keeping a sensible distance. She paused. I wasn't keeping a sensible distance. He looked at her. Eleanor, I'm not finished. She straightened. I need you to know that I am not a project. I am not someone to be rescued or managed or protected with the weight of your name. I have been those things for other people, or they have tried to make me those things, and I have said no every time, and I will keep saying no. Her voice was very steady. If that is what this is, whatever this is, even with the best intentions, then I need it to stop. The words sat in the air between them. James looked at her for a long time, long enough that Eleanor became aware of her own heartbeat. And if it isn't, he said quietly. She looked at him. If it isn't a project, he said, if it isn't rescue or management or the weight of my name, he paused, each word chosen carefully. If it is something else entirely, something I have not adequately named yet even to myself, what then? Eleanor felt something shift. deep and slow like ground settling. She did not have an answer. She had prepared for many things. She had not prepared for that. Then, she said finally, very quietly, you would need to figure out how to do it differently, without deciding things for me, without the grand gestures in crowded rooms. A pause, quietly, like an equal. He absorbed that. I can do that, he said. You don't know that yet. No, he admitted, but I'd like the chance to find out. The elderly gentleman by the fire woke with a small start, looked around in mild confusion, and settled back into his book. Alina looked at James Ashford, this man who had walked into a ballroom 7 weeks ago and said something true out loud and upended the careful arrangements of her quiet life. I'm going home, she said, to Wiltshire at the end of the season. I know. That's 3 weeks. Yes. She picked up the book she had come for, held it against her chest like something steadying. I need to think, she said. Of course. She walked toward the door, stopped with her hand on it. You called me specific, she said without turning around. The first night at the ball, a pause. I remember, he said. I've been thinking about it since. She opened the door. The gray London afternoon came in cool and indifferent. That's all I wanted to say. She left. She did not look back. Behind her in the quiet library, James Ashford stood very still for a very long time. The last 3 weeks of the season passed the way difficult things often do. Slowly. And then, without warning, all at once. Alina did not see James. Not at Lady Pembroke's card evening, which she attended, and he did not. Not at the small concert in Grosvenor Square, where she sat beside her aunt and listened to a soprano sing something achingly beautiful about longing and thought, with great discipline, about absolutely nothing. Not at the 2 remaining dinner parties she could not avoid without causing her aunt genuine distress. He was not there. She noticed. She told herself she didn't. The silence was her own fault, and she knew it. She had walked out of that library and said, I need to think, and thinking was exactly what she had done, relentlessly, thoroughly, in the manner of a woman who had spent 31 years trusting her own mind and was not about to stop now. She thought about what he had said. Something else entirely. Something I have not adequately named yet, even to myself. She thought about the way he had listened, not performed listening, actually listened, every time she had spoken. About the gallery and the Scottish painting. About the dinner table and Lord Forsyth's empty opinions. About the library where he had stood still and let her speak without interrupting, without defending, without filling the silence with anything except his attention. She thought about the fact that she was 31 years old and had never once had a conversation with a man that felt like a conversation between equals. Until now. That was the unbearable part. Not that it might come to nothing. She had made her peace with things coming to nothing. She had a talent for it, built over years, reinforced at every turn. The unbearable part was that it had happened at all, that she now knew what it felt like. That she would go back to Wiltshire carrying the knowledge of it like a stone in her pocket, smooth from handling, heavier than it looked. Her aunt watched her with the careful eyes of a woman who had seen enough of life to recognize its particular cruelties. Margaret said nothing for the first week. The second week she said, once gently, You don't have to decide everything alone, you know. Alina said, I know. She continued deciding everything alone. James, across the city, was doing something he had not done in years. Sitting still. Not the composed stillness of a duke in a public room, the other kind. The kind that happens when a person stops managing themselves long enough to notice what is actually there. He sat in his study at the Mayfair house on a Tuesday evening with a glass of brandy. He wasn't drinking and thought about Alina Voss with the focused honesty he usually reserved for problems that required solving. Except this was not a problem that required solving. That was the first thing he had to unlearn. She had said it plainly, without deciding things for me, without the grand gestures, quietly, like an equal. He had spent 33 years in a world that ran on grand gestures. His title was a grand gesture simply by existing. Every room he walked into rearranged itself around him without his doing anything. He had so long inhabited this particular gravity that he had stopped noticing it, had stopped understanding that what felt to him like standing still was, to everyone around him, a force they had to navigate. Eleanor had not rearranged herself. From the first moment, standing near her pillar, walking away from a gutting conversation with the composure of someone who expected nothing better, she had simply been exactly what she was, in front of him, without adjustment. He had not understood until the library what that had cost her. He understood now. His mother had written twice in the past week. Lady Cecily Ford was mentioned in the first letter, a Miss Harrington in the second, both young, both correct, both entirely without fault. He had not replied to either letter. He knew what he wanted. The question, the only question, and it was not a small one, was whether he could be what was required to deserve it. Hargreaves knocked on the study door at 8:30. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace. A note has arrived." James looked up. "From whom?" A pause that told him everything before the answer came. "Mrs. Margaret Voss," Hargreaves said. James was very still for a moment. He took the note. It was brief. Margaret Voss wrote the way she moved through a ballroom, purposeful, no wasted steps. "Your Grace, my niece leaves for Wiltshire on Friday. She has not asked me to write this letter. She would be very irritated to know I have. I am writing it anyway because I am 62 years old and I have learned that the cost of saying nothing is sometimes higher than the cost of saying the wrong thing. Eleanor has spent 12 years building a life that does not require anyone to show up for her. She is very good at it. She will be fine without you. I simply thought you should know that fine and happy are not the same thing. Yours faithfully, M. Voss." James read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He looked at the wall for a long time. Fine and happy are not the same thing. He knew that. He had known it since he came back from the war to a house that was exactly as he had left it and felt nothing like home. He had been fine for 7 months. Functioning, correct, present at the right events, saying the right things. Not happy. He had stopped expecting happy. He had made his arrangements the same as Eleanor and had been getting on with it. And then, Friday, he thought, today was Tuesday, he stood up. He did not go to Eleanor. That was important. He understood that now. He did not go to her with a plan, a gesture, a public declaration. He did not do anything that was about his own urgency. Instead, he did something small. He wrote a letter, not long, not elaborate. He wrote it 3 times before he had a version he trusted, plain, honest, no performance in it. He sent it Wednesday morning. Eleanor received it Wednesday afternoon. She was in her room, beginning the slow archaeology of packing. Which dresses had been worn, which books acquired, what version of herself she was bringing back to Wiltshire, and what she was leaving behind. The note was folded simply. No seal. Just her name on the outside in handwriting that was precise without being ornamental. She sat on the edge of the bed and read it. "Miss Voss, I have spent the past 2 weeks trying to find the grand gesture that would fix what I did wrong. I keep arriving at the same conclusion. There isn't one. Which is, I think, exactly what you were trying to tell me. I don't want to decide things for you. I don't want to manage or rescue or protect. I am aware that I have a long history of doing all 3 without noticing, and that awareness is not the same as having solved it, but I wanted you to know it exists. I have one question, not a demand, not a plan, just a question which you may answer or not as you choose. May I write to you, in Wiltshire, not to convince you of anything, not to continue whatever argument I have clearly been losing since the night we met, simply to continue the conversation, which I find unexpectedly that I am not ready to end. Yours, J. Ashford." Eleanor read it once, then again. Then she sat for a long time with it in her hands, looking at nothing in particular. Outside the window, London was doing what London did, loud and indifferent and entirely unaware that a woman was sitting in a narrow house on a Wednesday afternoon holding a piece of paper and feeling the ground shift very slowly beneath her feet. She thought about Wiltshire, the garden, Horatio, the library with 3 walls of unfinished books. The life she had built that was small and quiet and entirely hers. She thought about fine and happy not being the same thing. She thought about a door slightly open and a draft coming through it. She found her writing paper. She wrote 4 words, "You may write, Ivas." She sealed it before she could change her mind, handed it to the maid, went back to her packing. She was smiling, very slightly. In the way she had learned to smile, quietly, inwardly, in spaces where no one could see it and draw conclusions. Some things, she thought, were only for herself, for now. The letters began the week Alina returned to Wiltshire. His arrived on a Thursday. She noted the timing without meaning to, the way you note things you are pretending not to track. Delivered by the regular post, her name in that precise, unhurried hand, no ducal seal, nothing that announced itself. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. He wrote the way he talked, no performance in it, no carefully constructed charm. He wrote about Ralston Park, the estate he had returned to after the war and found simultaneously familiar and foreign, like a language he had once spoken fluently, and now had to think about. He wrote about his mother, with a dry affection that made Alina press her lips together to keep from smiling. He wrote about a tenant dispute he was mediating, asking her opinion on a point of fairness with the genuine curiosity of a man who actually wanted the answer. He did not write about feelings. Neither did she. They wrote around the thing between them the way you walk around a piece of furniture in a dark room, carefully, aware of exactly where it is, not quite ready to turn on the light. Alina wrote about the garden, which was recovering from her absence with the mild reproach of something that had managed without her and wanted her to know it. She wrote about Horatio, who had greeted her return with the dignified enthusiasm of a dog who had missed her enormously and intended to make her work for it. She wrote about a book she had found in the library, one of her father's, half annotated in his handwriting, the note stopping abruptly 60 pages from the end in a way she found both sad and very like him. She wrote honestly. She did not write carefully. That was, she realized, the difference. 4 weeks passed, then 5. Then a letter arrived that was slightly longer than the others, and she knew before she finished the first paragraph that something had changed. "My mother came to Ralston Park last week," he wrote. "She brought with her a Miss Harrington of Derbyshire, presented as a coincidence, which it was not. Miss Harrington is 22, accomplished, entirely without fault, and looked at me across the dinner table with the expression of someone completing an assignment. I was polite. I was also, I confess, poor company. My mother spoke to me afterward. She is not a subtle woman. Subtlety, she has always maintained, is for people who have time to waste. She told me that I was being foolish, that whatever I was imagining was not realistic, that a man in my position had responsibilities that outweighed personal inclination. She used the word inclination as though it were a mild eccentricity, a preference for a particular wine, something to be managed. I didn't argue with her. I have learned over 33 years that arguing with my mother requires energy better spent elsewhere. But I thought about what you said in the library, about fine and happy not being the same thing." Alina stopped. Read that last line again. She had not said that in the library. She had never said that to him at all. She thought for a moment, then understood. Her aunt, Margaret Voss, she thought, with a feeling that was exasperation and love in equal and indistinguishable measure. "You absolute woman," she kept reading. "I am telling you this not to pressure you, not to make a claim. I am telling you because you asked me once to do things quietly and without deciding for you. And I think the quiet version of what I want to say is this: I am not fine. I have been fine for a long time and I had made my peace with it. And then I met someone specific, your word, though I think I meant it first, and fine became considerably harder to live with. That is all. No grand gesture, no crowded room. Just the truth, which I believe you prefer. Yours, J." Alina put the letter down, picked it up, put it down again. She sat in the window seat of the library, her father's books around her, Horatio's warm weight against her feet, the autumn garden visible through the glass, going quietly gold, and felt the full complicated weight of being a person who had stopped wanting things and had been ambushed by wanting something anyway. She did not write back that day. She needed to think. She was, she knew, running out of reasons that held. She was still thinking on the Tuesday when the carriage arrived. She heard it from the garden, the sound of wheels on the gravel drive, unexpected, no visitors anticipated. She came around the side of the house with dirt on her gloves and her hair in a state that her aunt would have described as a situation, and found a carriage she didn't recognize and a man climbing down from it who she did. James Ashford, in Wiltshire. Standing in her gravel drive with leaves on the ground around him and an expression that was, she searched for the word apprehensive. That was new. She had seen him composed and warm and uncertain and honest, but she had not seen apprehensive. She stood very still. "You didn't write back," he said. "It has been 4 days. I know." A pause. "I was not going to come. I had decided not to come." He looked at her steadily. "I came anyway." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "This," she said, "is a grand gesture." "Yes," he admitted, "I know. You drove to Wiltshire. It is not so very far. It is 4 hours. 3.5, he said. "The roads are good this time of year." Despite everything, despite the 4 days of thinking and the careful walls and the 31 years of practice, Eleanor felt something move in her chest, something warm and inconvenient and entirely beyond her management. "I told you," she said carefully, "no grand gestures." "You did." He took a breath. "And I tried, I wrote the letters, I waited. I did not decide things." A pause. "But I find that I have one thing left that requires saying out loud in person, and I could not make it fit in a letter without it becoming either too small or too large." She waited. He crossed the gravel, stopped 3 feet from her. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," he said. "I'm not here to convince you or to rescue you or to decide what comes next. I am here because I needed you to know, with no room for misinterpretation, no letter that can be read in multiple ways, that what I feel is not inclination." The word landed the way he intended it. "It is not novelty, and it is not diversion, and it is not charity." He held her gaze. "It is the most specific thing I have felt in 33 years. And you deserve to hear that plainly, whatever you do with it." The garden was very quiet, a bird somewhere, the wind in the old oak at the edge of the drive. Eleanor looked at him, this man in her gravel drive with leaves around his boots and 3.5 hours of road behind him and no plan for what happened next. "You have dirt on your glove," he said quietly. "I was gardening," she said. "I know, I saw you come around the house." A pause. "You looked exactly like yourself." She felt the ground shift, the deep, slow kind. "James," she said. The first time she had used his name, something moved across his face. "You should come inside," she said. "It's cold." "Is that—" He stopped. "It means come inside," she said. "It means I'll make tea. It means we will sit in the library and talk, and I will tell you what I have been thinking for 4 days, and you will listen without interrupting." A pause. "It means I am not ready to say everything yet, but I am not sending you back to your carriage either." He was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is enough." She turned toward the house. He fell into step beside her, not behind, not ahead, beside. They sat in the library for 3 hours. Horatio, after a period of dignified assessment, settled across James's feet with the air of a dog making a considered decision. James looked down at him with an expression of such genuine surprise and pleasure that Eleanor had to look at her teacup. They talked. About real things, his mother, her brother, the war, the choices she had made and what they had cost and what they had given her. About what he wanted his life to look like, now that the version he had planned was gone. About what she had been building in Wiltshire and whether it was what she actually wanted or just what she had taught herself to want. He did not interrupt. He asked good questions. At some point the tea went cold and neither of them noticed. At 5 o'clock he stood to leave. He had to be back on the road. It was a long drive. The light was going. He said this practically with no drama, which she appreciated. At the door he stopped, turned. "I should tell you," he said, "my mother will not approve." "I know," Eleanor said. "There will be talk, more talk. There always is. It will not be easy, James." She looked at him steadily. "I have been not easy my entire life. I am very good at it." The full smile came then, not the almost, not the corner of the mouth, the real thing, and it was considerably more devastating than she had anticipated. "Yes," he said, "you are." He left. She stood in the doorway and watched the carriage until it disappeared around the bend in the road. Horatio sat beside her, leaning against her leg with his whole weight, which was his way. "Don't," she told him. He looked up at her with 11 years of patient wisdom. She went inside. She sat down in the library. She pressed her hands against her face and breathed slowly. She realized, smiling so widely it almost hurt. She did not sleep well that night, not because she was unhappy. That was the strange part. The not sleeping had nothing to do with unhappiness. It was the other thing, the rarer thing, the thing she had almost forgotten the feeling of: hope. Hope was, she had learned over 31 years, considerably more disruptive than disappointment. Disappointment settled. It found its level and stayed there, and you built around it, and eventually it became just part of the landscape. Hope moved. Hope kept you awake at 5 in the morning staring at the ceiling of a Wiltshire bedroom while a dog snored at your feet and the darkness pressed softly against the windows. She had been so careful not to hope. She had been hoping for weeks. She rose before dawn, put on her oldest dress, the practical one, the one her aunt had never seen and would have strong opinions about, and went out into the garden. This was what she did when she needed to think clearly. Not sit in chairs, not pace rooms. The garden in the early morning when the light was just beginning and the world was still deciding what kind of day it intended to be. She walked the familiar paths. The rose beds, cut back for winter now, stubby and unpromising in the way that things are before they become what they are. The old apple tree at the far end, half its leaves gone, the remaining ones hanging on with the determination of things that weren't ready yet. The low stone wall where she had sat as a child reading books she was probably too young for, deciding privately that the world outside was more interesting than the world being presented to her indoors. Horatio walked beside her, steady and unhurried. 11 years old. He had seen everything and forgotten nothing and loved her without conditions, which was its own kind of education. She thought about James Ashford standing in her gravel drive with leaves around his boots. She thought about the most specific thing I have felt in 33 years. She thought about fine and happy not being the same thing. The question was not whether she felt it. She had stopped pretending about that somewhere around the 4th letter, though she had kept the pretending going internally for another 2 weeks out of sheer habit. The question was the real one. The one she had been turning over since the library on Piccadilly, since the ball, since a man with a calm voice had said something true in a crowded room and she had stood 6 feet away and felt the ground shift. Could she do this? Not did she want to. Wanting was the easy part, it turned out, after years of believing it was the hard part. Wanting had arrived without asking permission and installed itself completely and showed no signs of leaving. Could she do this? The actual this. The thing that came after yes. Because yes, if she said it, meant something real. It meant his mother who would not approve. It meant London and the room she had spent 12 years navigating alone, now navigated differently, which was not the same as easily. It meant being looked at, she and James, together, by every drawing room in Mayfair, and those rooms had not been kind to her, and would not become kind simply because a duke had decided she was worth his time. It meant trusting that he meant what he said. That the man who had gotten it wrong in Whitmore's reception had actually understood what she told him in the library. Not just heard it, understood it, changed because of it. She thought about the letters, the ones that didn't perform, the ones that asked her opinion on tenant disputes and told her about his mother with dry affection and described coming home from the war to a house that felt like a language he'd forgotten. She thought about yesterday afternoon, 3 hours in the library, the tea going cold, Horatio across his feet. He had not interrupted once. She sat down on the low stone wall. The light was coming properly now, pale and clean, the autumn kind that didn't promise warmth but delivered honesty. The garden around her was half gone and half waiting, the way gardens are at this time of year, neither one thing nor the other, full of potential it wasn't showing yet. She thought about Charles Whitmore at 19, the selection in his eyes. She thought about the widower who wanted a mother for his children. She thought about the man she had genuinely liked and said no to with some grief, alone in another garden in another season, a long time ago. She thought about what had been different, every time. The thing she had kept saying no to because it wasn't quite the right thing. The unnamed thing she had held out for without admitting she was holding out for anything. Being seen, just that. The extraordinary, ordinary thing of being in a room with a person who was looking at the actual you, not the useful you, not the correct you, not the version that fit the space available, but the specific, particular, inconvenient, real you. James Ashford had called her specific on the first night as though it were the highest possible compliment. She had been thinking about it ever since. Horatio put his gray muzzle on her knee. She looked down at him. "I know," she said. He blinked slowly. "It's frightening," she told him. He shifted his weight against her leg. "Yes," she said. "All right." She went inside, washed her hands, put the kettle on, sat at the writing table in the morning room with the pale light coming through the window and the garden visible behind her reflection in the glass. She took out her writing paper. She sat for a moment, pen in hand, thinking about all the careful letters she had written in her life. The polite refusals, the cordial nothing letters to her brother, the thank you notes and the decline with regrets and the years of writing around the truth because the truth was too inconvenient to deliver directly. She put the pen down, picked it up again, wrote 2 lines. James received the letter on Thursday morning. He was at breakfast, which he had been eating with the appetite of a man who had not slept particularly well for several weeks and was beginning to find the situation tiresome. Hargreaves brought the post on a silver tray with the expression of a man who had noticed the Wiltshire postmark and was performing neutrality with considerable effort. James set down his fork, picked up the letter, opened it. 2 lines. "I have been thinking since before dawn. I find that fine is no longer sufficient. Come back to Wiltshire." He read it twice, set it down, picked it up and read it once more. Then he stood up, pushed back his chair and said, "Hargreaves, have the carriage ready within the hour." Hargreaves, who had been performing neutrality for approximately 45 seconds and found it an uncomfortable fit, allowed himself a very small smile. "Yes, Your Grace," he said. "I'll let the kitchen know you won't be finishing breakfast." It was raining when the carriage came up the drive. Alina heard it from the hall where she had been standing for the past 20 minutes doing absolutely nothing and refusing to acknowledge why. She opened the door before he had reached the steps. He stopped. She stopped. The rain came down between them, steady and honest, the Wiltshire kind that didn't apologize. "You came back," she said. "You asked me to." "I know." A pause. "I wasn't certain you would." "Alina." He looked at her with an expression she had no name for, something complete, something that had stopped managing itself. "I would have come back without being asked." She felt it again. The ground shifting, the door open. She stepped back from the threshold. "Come in," she said. "You're getting wet." He came inside. The door closed behind him. They stood in the hall of the small Wiltshire house. Not a grand house, not a London house, not the kind of house that featured in anyone's vision of how a duke spent his Thursday, and looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when the long middle part is over and something new is beginning. "I meant what I said," Alina told him, "about how this has to work. No deciding for me. No grand gestures in crowded rooms. No using your name as a solution to problems that require different solutions." "I know," he said. "I will argue with you. I'm counting on it. Your mother will be difficult." "My mother is always difficult. I have survived 33 years of it." "James," she looked at him steadily. "I am not a small life that needs expanding. I am not a project or a rescue. I am a person who has built something real here in this house, in this garden, on her own terms. And I will not unmake that for anyone. Not even," she stopped. "Not even," he said quietly. She held his gaze. "Not even someone I have been thinking about since a Tuesday night in April when he called me specific and I went home and couldn't sleep." The hall was very quiet. James crossed the distance between them, not quickly, not dramatically, the way a man crosses a room when he is certain and unhurried and has thought carefully about the ground beneath his feet. He took her hand, not her gloved hand, her actual hand bare, still slightly cold from the morning garden. He held it in both of his and said nothing for a moment. Then, "I don't want to expand your life. I don't want to rescue it or improve it or make it more appropriate for a drawing room." He looked at her steadily. "I want to be in it, whatever it is, as it is." A pause. "If you'll have me." Alina looked at their hands, looked at him. 12 years of careful arrangements, 12 years of fine, 12 years of window seats and small smiles kept entirely for herself, in carriages and libraries and narrow London houses, because there was no one to share them with. She thought about the door. She thought about the draft. She thought about what was on the other side. "Yes," she said, simple, no performance. Just the word, plain and real, offered to a man who had earned it slowly and honestly and without deciding anything for her. His hands tightened around hers. "Yes," she said again, because it deserved saying twice. "I'll have you." Outside, the Wiltshire rain continued, steady, patient, entirely indifferent to its own beauty. Inside, something that had been quiet for a very long time made a sound like a door opening wide. The wedding was small. Alina had been firm about that. Not a spectacle, not a production, not the kind of event that existed primarily to be talked about afterward. A church in the village, the one she had attended since childhood, where the pews were worn and the windows let in a particular afternoon light that she had always found honest. Her aunt in the front row, crying with the dignified composure of a woman who had earned her tears. William, her brother, present and slightly bewildered and making a genuine effort, which Alina had decided to count. Horatio had not been permitted inside the church. He had waited at the gate with the rector's spaniel and the expression of a dog who had opinions about being excluded from significant events, but was choosing on this occasion to be gracious about it. James's mother had attended. This had been unexpected. She had sat in the second row in an extraordinary hat and said nothing objectionable to anyone, which Alina suspected had cost her considerable effort, and which she privately respected more than any warm speech could have earned. Afterward, at the small luncheon in the garden of the Wiltshire house, the Dowager Duchess of Ralston had found Alina alone near the rose beds, blooming now, properly, with the fullness of things that had been patiently waiting. She had looked at Alina for a long moment with eyes that were very like her son's. "You are not what I would have chosen," she said. "No," Alina agreed. "I know." "You are also," the Dowager said, with the precision of a woman who did not waste words, "the first person I have seen make him entirely himself in 33 years. She said nothing further, moved away. The hat was remarkable from every angle. Alina stood among the roses and felt something settle in her chest that had no name but needed none. A year after that rainy Thursday in Wiltshire, a year after yes said plainly in a hall that smelled of old wood and garden, and someone else's life becoming hers, Alina sat at the writing table in the library at Ralston Park. It was morning. The good kind, slow and unhurried, light coming through the tall windows at an angle that made everything look considered. The library at Ralston Park was considerably larger than the one in Wiltshire, 3 times the walls and twice the books, which had been one of the few things about the arrangement that had required no persuasion whatsoever. She was writing a letter to Dorothea Hale, who had sent a note last spring, careful and warm, and deserved a proper reply. "Dear Dorothea, you wrote to warn me once when the talk was unkind. I have not forgotten that. I wanted to write now belatedly to tell you that things are, I keep reaching for the right word and finding only simple ones which I have decided to trust. Good. Things are good." She stopped, looked out the window at the Ralston grounds, broad and autumnal, going gold at the edges, the kind of landscape that had taken her completely by surprise when she first saw it because it was beautiful in exactly the way she hadn't expected. She heard him before she saw him, footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, the particular rhythm she had learned the way you learn a sound that matters. The door opened. James came in carrying 2 cups of tea with the expression of a man who had decided, somewhere in the past year, that waiting for someone else to bring the tea was a poor use of available time. He had developed several such positions since the wedding. Alina found them, without exception, unreasonably endearing. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early." "You are," he agreed. He set the tea beside her, looked over her shoulder at the letter without reading it, which was one of the many small things she had noticed about him, and quietly catalogued. "Dorothea Hale, finally. What are you telling her?" Alina looked at the letter. "Good, things are good. The truth," she said, "which is that I was wrong." He settled into the chair across from her, picked up his own tea, looked at her with the expression she had found no adequate name for and had stopped trying, the complete one, the one that had stopped managing itself. "Wrong about what?" he said. "I told my aunt last season that I knew how things like this ended." She looked at him. "I was very certain, I had evidence. And I was wrong." She looked at her letter. "I have been wrong about several things, it turns out. I find I don't mind as much as I expected." James was quiet for a moment. Outside, the grounds were going about their morning business, birds, wind, the distant sound of someone beginning the day's work in the stables. "Alina," he said. She looked up. "I was wrong about things too," he said. "Considerably more things than you." "Yes," she agreed, "you were. And you let me be wrong and then told me plainly and waited to see if I could do better." "I did. That," he said quietly, "was the bravest thing anyone has ever done for me." She looked at him across the library, this large, honest room full of books she intended to finish, and mornings she had not yet had, and a life that was nothing like what she had arranged for herself, and everything she had stopped letting herself want. "Don't make me sentimental before 9 o'clock, she said. "I have a letter to finish." He smiled. "The full one, the devastating one." "Finish your letter," he said. She turned back to the page. "Things are good," she had written. She looked at it for a moment, then added, "I was under the impression for a very long time that fine was sufficient. I have recently revised this position. I recommend the revision. It is uncomfortable and frightening and entirely worth it. I will write more soon. There is a great deal to tell. Yours with great affection, Alina Ashford." She set down her pen, picked up her tea. Outside the tall windows, the Ralston grounds continued their slow golden morning, entirely indifferent to how long it had taken to get here. Inside, the library was warm and quiet, and full of the particular quality of a life that had been chosen rather than assigned. Horatio, who had made the move to Ralston Park with the dignified adaptability of a dog who had always known the world would eventually arrange itself correctly, was asleep in front of the fire. He was 12 years old now, gray around the muzzle, slow on the stairs, deeply satisfied in the way of creatures who have arrived at exactly where they are supposed to be. Alina watched him for a moment. Then she looked at James, who was reading something, comfortable and unhurried, entirely himself in the way his mother had said, and the way she had known long before that, since a library on Piccadilly, since a gallery in St. James's, since a ballroom in April where a man had said something true out loud and she had been standing 6 feet away, and felt the whole arrangement of her life begin, very quietly, to change. She had built a small life in Wiltshire, and it had been hers, and she had been proud of it. This was also hers. That was the thing no one had told her, that it didn't have to be one or the other. That a life built carefully and alone could become, without being dismantled, something larger. That the garden in Wiltshire still existed, and she still walked it when she needed to think, and Horatio still walked beside her. That she still had opinions and expressed them, and was still called specific, and still sat near windows at events she found tedious, and still could not produce a convincing false smile to save her life. She was still entirely herself. She was also, against all reasonable expectation, entirely happy. Later that morning, James found her in the library garden, the small walled one off the east wing that she had claimed within her first week at Ralston Park and begun quietly reorganizing. She was on her knees in the soil, doing something purposeful with a trowel, her hair escaping its pins in the specific way it always did when she had been outside for more than 20 minutes. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. She looked up. "You're going to say something," she said. "I was just looking. You have a look on your face." "What kind of look?" She sat back on her heels and studied him with the directness he had loved since the first night. No softening of it, no social padding, just Alina Voss looking at a thing and saying what she saw. "The kind," she said, "that you had in the ballroom, when you heard those women, when you decided to say something." He was quiet for a moment. "You remember that look?" "I remember everything about that night," she said simply. "It was the night the whole arrangement started going wrong." A pause, and there it was, the corner of her mouth, the almost smile she had tried to keep to herself and eventually stopped bothering. Or right, depending on how you look at it. He crossed the garden, crouched down beside her in the soil, entirely without concern for his coat, which was another of the small things she had catalogued. "Right," he said, "definitively right." She looked at him. The garden was quiet around them, walls on all sides, the good enclosed kind of quiet, the kind that holds things safely. "Yes," Alina said, "I think so too." She handed him the trowel. He took it without question. They worked in comfortable silence as the morning opened around them, gold and unhurried, the autumn kind, honest about what it was and making no promises beyond the present moment. Which was, Alina had learned, exactly enough. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.